In an airport VIP lounge, a seemingly simple woman silently endures the public humiliation of her ex-husband, who treated her as a failure in front of everyone. Convinced that he has won at life and that she is nothing more than a mistake from the past, he laughs, mocks her, and believes he has taken everything that mattered from her. But what no one in that room imagines is that, while he brags about his success, a gigantic secret is about to land outside. And when a private jet finally touches the runway, the truth emerges in such a brutal way that the man who despised her discovers too late who really lost everything. Before discovering how this twist completely changes everyone's destiny, subscribe to the channel and prepare yourself for a powerful story about humiliation, silence, intelligence, and a revenge that no one saw coming. The VIP lounge of the Congonhas Executive Airport had that characteristic smell of expensive air conditioning and ill-disguised ambition. Beige leather armchairs arranged in discreet rows, a silent buffet with fruit cut into perfect cubes, high-speed Wi-Fi, and the tacit promise that everyone inside was important. Daniela Marques entered with a small suitcase and a worn fabric bag, and neither item matched the environment. She knew it. She knew the protocol of that place well. She had frequented that same room dozens of times, but in another life, alongside another man, with another name engraved on the boarding pass, and with the invisible weight of someone who carries another's work on their back without anyone noticing. Today, the pass said only what it needed to say. She didn't need anything more than that. The receptionist checked the document with that trained politeness that reveals no judgment, but also hides no surprise, and pointed to an armchair near the window with a view of the runway. Daniela thanked her with a brief smile, and walked there without haste, without that anxious urgency that usually accompanies people who still have something to prove. Outside, the Congonhas runway shone under the São Paulo afternoon sun, a March sun that hit from the side and left everything with that golden and slightly dazzling hue. She always liked that light. She always thought that São Paulo was more honest when illuminated like that, without filters, without the mist of dawn or the coldness of daybreak. The city showed its scars and did not apologize. Daniela had learned to do the same. She took the notebook from the bottom of her bag with the care of someone handling something worth more than it seems, and opened it on her lap. The screen displayed a series of open windows with spreadsheets, financial projections, and a technical document in English that anyone outside the field would consider incomprehensible. For her, it was just the usual work, dense, silent, absolutely hers. There was a meeting scheduled for the next day in Lisbon. It wasn't just any meeting. It was the kind of encounter that happens once in someone's life, if that person has done everything right for a long time, alone and without anyone noticing. Daniela had done it, and now the result was there, represented in a sequence of numbers she knew by heart, each figure corresponding to a night of work that no one had seen, to a decision she had made alone in the silence of her small apartment in Pinheiros. She ordered a coffee from the waiter who passed by without needing to raise her voice. Just a slight nod, and she returned to the document. For a few minutes the world was just those lines of commented code and those projections she herself had built over 18 months of uninterrupted work. There were nights when she slept 3 hours and woke up with the solution to a problem that had haunted her the day before. There were entire weekends where the only sound in the apartment was the click of the keyboard and the wind coming through the half-open window. She did not lament this. It was the price she had chosen to pay, and she had absolute clarity that the bill would come due in her favor. She observed the room with discretion. There was a middle-aged businessman talking on his cell phone loudly, as if the volume of his own voice confirmed the importance of the subject. There was a young couple in designer clothes and that slightly bored expression of someone who travels frequently and is no longer impressed by anything. There was a woman in a grey suit who appeared to be a lawyer, concentrated on her own screen. No one paid attention to Daniela. No one ever paid attention to Daniela, and that was exactly what had always protected her. Then the door to the VIP lounge opened in a way she recognized even before turning her head. It was a specific way of entering a place, that movement that occupies space before the body crosses the threshold, as if the presence needed to arrive before the person. She knew that energy. She had lived with it for 11 years, and even after everything, Her body still registered the pattern before her mind processed it. It was like recognizing a timbre of voice or the smell of a time in life that no longer exists. Rodrigo Cavalcanti entered accompanied by Fernanda, his current wife, and an assistant who carried a black leather folder and seemed to exist only to appear busy in his vicinity. Rodrigo was in a well-cut navy blue suit, with his hair slightly long on the sides the way he wore it, when he wanted to seem uncomplicated, but sophisticated at the same time. Fernanda came in a tight wine-colored dress, long nails, and the expression of someone who just arrived from somewhere worth posting on social media. They were both handsome. Daniela recognized this with the same coldness with which she recognized any objective fact. It was a data point, not a pain. Rodrigo swept the room with his eyes and stopped when he found hers. There was a moment of genuine hesitation, too brief to be noticed by anyone who didn't know him. For Daniela, it was the equivalent of a confession. Then he curled his lips into a smile that didn't reach his eyes and walked toward her with the ease of someone about to perform a rehearsed act. That kind of confidence that is, in fact, a sophisticated form of defense. "Danny, what a surprise," he said, with his voice calibrated between affection and condescension, in a tone that made it difficult to identify where one ended and the other began. "Still traveling commercial?" Daniela closed the notebook slowly, with care. "Rodrigo," she said simply, the name weighing exactly right, without affection or hostility, like someone naming a geographic coordinate. Fernanda positioned herself beside her husband with a sharp smile intended to be kind. "You work in technology, don't you?" "He told me. Something small, technical support or something like that," she said, looking at the fabric bag as if that detail already said enough about the person carrying it. Daniela looked at Fernanda with that calmness it had taken 18 months to build, a calmness that was not indifference but looked like it from the outside, like a water surface that does not reveal the depth beneath. She did not answer the question. She took a sip of her coffee. Rodrigo interpreted the silence as embarrassment, and this visibly encouraged him. "We'll take the chance to sit here nearby," he said, indicating the adjacent armchairs as if he were doing a favor. "We have a little time before boarding," he added, with the slightly forced laughter of someone who thinks they are being generous by granting their own presence. She said nothing. She turned her eyes back to the window. Outside, a plane taxied slowly toward the hangar. The sun was going down, and the runway shone like a horizontal mirror. Somewhere above the clouds, the destiny she herself had built waited for her with patience, just as she had waited for the right moment for a long time. Without rushing, without showing what she carried, without giving her adversary any information he could use against her. The man sitting 2 meters from her, with all his well-dressed arrogance and his conveniently edited selective memory, still did not know what he was about to witness. Daniela opened the notebook again and went back to work, as she had always done, in silence, while the world around judged by what it saw on the surface, and she simply advanced through everything she had built underneath, layer by layer. In every night no one saw, and every morning no one celebrated. Rodrigo was not the type of man who sat in silence when there was an audience available. It was a characteristic Daniela had observed since the beginning, even before falling in love with him, back when they were colleagues at a startup accelerator in the Villa Olympia neighborhood. He needed an audience. He needed an echo. And when the environment placed someone in a seemingly inferior position beside him, the instinct to perform became as irresistible as a tide. He settled into the armchair beside her with Fernanda at his flank and the assistant 2 steps behind and began to speak. He commented on the flight, on the destination, on a deal he was about to close in London with a European digital infrastructure company. He used the company's name 3 times in 2 minutes. Daniela listened with enough attention to maintain the appearance of presence and enough distance not to let any of the words truly land. It was a skill she had developed over many years of living with him. Fernanda contributed from time to time, with comments calibrated to amplify her husband and diminish everything around. She praised his suit loudly enough for others to hear. She mentioned the address of the new office on Faria Lima like someone mentioning a credential. She looked at Daniela's bag for the 2nd time with that smile that intended to be kind but was actually a way of saying, "I am above you and we both know it." Rodrigo then leaned his body slightly toward Daniela and said, in a voice that simulated concern, "Are you okay? I mean, financially. I heard you had opened something, but the technology market is difficult for those who work alone, without structure." Daniela placed her coffee on the side table. "I'm great," she said. Rodrigo nodded with that expression of someone who doesn't believe it, but decides to be kind anyway. "Good, good. If one day you need a recommendation or a talk about opportunities, talk to me. The company is growing a lot. There's always space for people with technical skills at the base, you know. Operational work, system support, it's honest, it's stable." He was offering her a technical support job, to her, with that tone of benevolence that is only possible when one genuinely believes the other person has no way out. Daniela looked at him for a few seconds. She said nothing, and it was exactly this silence that made Rodrigo continue, because he could not stand silence when he interpreted it as an opening to fill. "You know what it is, Danny. You were always very good at the technical side. But the market isn't about technicality, it's about vision, about relationships, about knowing how to sell an idea before it exists. And that, well, you know it was never your forte. It's not a criticism, just an observation." Fernanda smiled, agreeing with her husband, as if that speech were a kindness and not a stab carefully disguised as advice. Daniela thought of 11 years. She thought of the nights she stayed awake solving system architecture problems, while Rodrigo slept without worry, confident that the solution would appear because it always did, but without ever asking where it came from. She thought of the presentations she wrote, and he delivered before investors with the charm and ease he indeed had. She thought of the day she realized he had started to believe his own narrative, the day he used the word "I" where he should have said "we," and she saw in his eyes that it wasn't a mistake, it was a conviction. She thought of all this and said none of it. She said only, "Thank you for the offer." The phrase was so neutral, so devoid of any expected reaction, that Rodrigo slightly furrowed his brow. He was used to two reactions: either people agreed enthusiastically, or they defended themselves with indignation. Daniela's calibrated silence fit neither pattern, and this left him slightly off balance, like someone tripping on a surface that seemed flat. Fernanda filled the space with ease. "Do you travel for work?" "Where to?" she asked, with the tone of someone asking a polite question, but having already formulated their own answer. "Lisbon," Daniela said. Rodrigo and Fernanda exchanged a quick look. Lisbon was also their destination. The coincidence was too small to be significant, and too large to be ignored comfortably. "Business?" Rodrigo asked, his voice slightly hardened. "Yes," Daniela replied. Rodrigo nodded slowly, processing. "Then it must be the outsourcing area. There are many Portuguese companies seeking Brazilian technical support, cheap labor. It makes sense for those who are starting out." Daniela did not correct him. It wasn't necessary. Time would say what needed to be said, and time was on her side in a way he had not yet understood. She went back to the notebook. On the screen, the technical document waited with its quiet density, with its numbers and its architectures, with the entire structure of something she had built alone in 18 months of silent work in a Pinheiros apartment that Rodrigo had never visited. There was a deep irony in all of it, an irony she didn't need to name out loud because she felt it in her whole body, with the clarity of someone who knows the hour has come, but that the hour has not yet completely arrived. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. She thought of the apartment, the late nights, the code she had written and rewritten until it was perfect, the patent he had discarded in the divorce as if it were a technical trinket without commercial value, the same patent that was now the backbone of a platform that a European company had valued in numbers that neither of the two people sitting beside her could pronounce without choking. When she opened her eyes, Rodrigo was still talking, this time about a dinner he had organized the previous week with American investors. He used his hands to draw the size of the room, the prestige of those present, the value of the wine served. He was a man building a monument to himself in real time, bricks made of words. Daniela looked at the window. The sun had changed angle, and now the runway outside was partially in shadow. Somewhere in that São Paulo afternoon, an aircraft was on an approach path. She didn't know exactly when it would land, but she knew it would land. The assistant approached Rodrigo discreetly and whispered something in his ear. He nodded without interrupting his own speech, only diverting his attention for a second, and then returned to the subject of the dinner, as if he hadn't even paused. It was this uninterrupted rhythm that made it difficult for most people to find an entry point to disagree. The speech occupied the whole space and left no crack. Daniela noticed there were other people in the room observing the trio with the polite discretion of someone who doesn't want to seem curious, but is very curious. The businessman on the cell phone had ended the call and was now leafing through a magazine without really reading it. The young couple looked sideways. The lawyer in the grey suit had raised her eyes from her laptop at least 3 times in the last few minutes. Rodrigo didn't notice any of this, or he noticed and interpreted it as admiration. Probably the second option. Fernanda ordered a glass of wine from the waiter with the naturalness of someone who never thinks twice before ordering something in a place like this. Then she turned to Daniela with an expression of curiosity that wasn't real curiosity. "Do you still live in Pinheiros?" she asked. "It must be practical for those who work from home." Daniela answered yes with the brevity of someone confirming a cartographic data point. "You needed to update your address," Fernanda commented, as if it were useful advice. "The best contacts are in time now. Where things really happen, you understand." Daniela understood. She understood that the conversation was a form of mapping, an attempt to confirm that she had stayed behind while they moved forward. She also understood that Fernanda herself didn't know she was operating within a narrative whose ending she was completely unaware of. There was no anger in this. There was only the quiet clarity of someone who possesses information the other does not. The coffee was getting cold. Daniela called the waiter and asked for another. When the waiter walked away, she met Rodrigo's eyes for a fraction of a second and saw there, beneath the varnish of performance, something he would never admit. A spark of uncertainty. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Daniela recognized it because she had spent years learning to read what he didn't say. He didn't know exactly where she stood, and that bothered him. She lowered her eyes to the notebook and continued working in silence. There was something Rodrigo never knew about Daniela, and it was precisely the most important thing. She had entered that relationship whole, with her own history, her own intelligence, her own ambitions that existed before him, and that continued to exist after he left, even though he had never noticed this while they were together. She remembered the day they met, a Tuesday afternoon at a startup accelerator in Villa Olympia, at a pitch event for angel investors. Daniela was 26 years old and was presenting a project for optimizing logistics processes she had developed as part of her master's in software engineering at USP. The project was technically sophisticated, and she knew how to present it with precision, but she also knew she needed to learn to translate that precision into market language. Rodrigo was the type of person who knew how to do exactly that. He was 30 years old, came from a family with a business history, frequented the right environments, and knew how to conduct a conversation in a way that made people feel they were being privileged with his attention. He approached her after the pitch with genuine questions about the system architecture. She was surprised because most people in that environment asked generic questions that were actually disguised statements. He wanted to truly understand, or at least simulated wanting to with a competence that she, at the time, did not know how to distinguish from the real thing. They exchanged contacts. They talked for weeks. They started working together informally, she developing, him opening doors. It seemed like a natural division of talents, an organic complementarity. What she didn't see or didn't want to see was the gradual process by which that division of talents was being rewritten in Rodrigo's memory as a hierarchy. Over time, what had been collaboration became support. What had been partnership became her dependence on him. In the narrative he built and refined over the years, he was the founder, the visionary, the engine of the company. She was the engineer who had helped a lot in the first years, a useful and competent person, but essentially a resource that could be replaced by another better resource in certain circumstances. The company they built together was called Vertex Systems and specialized in data integration solutions for large corporations. It grew rapidly in the first years thanks to contracts with banks and insurance companies that needed to connect legacy systems with modern platforms. A high-complexity technical problem that Daniela solved with an elegance that impressed even those who didn't fully understand what was being done. Rodrigo negotiated the contracts, maintained the relationships, represented the company at conferences and forums. He was the face. She was the backbone. For years this seemed sustainable. There was respect, there was affection, there was the shared pleasure of seeing something grow. But there was also an imbalance that deepened as the company gained visibility. Rodrigo started appearing in business magazines, being invited to discussion panels, being cited as a reference in technological innovation. And every time his name appeared in those contexts without hers beside it, something solidified in the public perception and, progressively, in his own perception. When the divorce came, Daniela had already known what was coming for some months. It wasn't a surprise, it was a confirmation. Rodrigo had found in Fernanda something she never wanted to be, a decorative and enthusiastically available presence, someone who admired him without questioning, who applauded him without understanding, and who would never ask him for credit for anything because she had never contributed anything that needed credit. The process was fast and brutal. His lawyers were better and more expensive. The agreement she signed in a state of emotional exhaustion and with insufficient legal advice left Rodrigo with the company, with the main assets, and with his public reputation intact. For her, a compensation that seemed reasonable on paper, but was derisory compared to what she had built, and a patent. A single patent, developed by her 2 years earlier as a side project, about a method of data compression and reprocessing in distributed environments. Rodrigo's lawyers didn't even discuss the point. The technical document had no immediate commercial appeal and was treated as a crumb. She signed, she kept the patent, and she started working. The idea she had encapsulated in that technical document was deeper than it seemed at first glance. Daniela took 3 months just to fully size up what she had created, like someone finding a hidden room in a house they already knew and discovering it is larger than the main room. The technology the patent described, with the developments and adaptations she implemented over the following months, was capable of solving a critical problem in large-scale data operations, a problem that several of the world's largest technology companies were trying to solve with much more costly and less efficient approaches. She worked alone for 18 months. No team, no investors, no office. Just her, the notebook, the apartment in Pinheiros, and the clarity of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why. She opened a simple company, registered in her own name, with a discreet name that didn't draw attention, DM Tecnologia Aplicada. It didn't have an elaborate website. It didn't have marketing communication. It had only the solution, documented, tested, refined, and ready to scale. The contact with the European company, Orbis Data Systems, had arrived through an indirect channel. An old colleague from USP who worked as a consultant in Lisbon had mentioned her work in a conversation with an Orbis executive. The executive had asked for a meeting. Daniela had prepared a 42-page presentation, sent it by email, and received back, 48 hours later, a counter-proposal with a number she had to read 3 times before believing. Tomorrow's meeting in Lisbon was to sign the contract. She thought of all this while looking at the notebook screen, with Rodrigo still talking beside her about some deal that probably didn't exist in the terms he described. And she felt, not for the first time, that silence was the most elegant way to keep a secret until the secret became reality. There was also a specific irony in all that which she appreciated with an almost intellectual coldness. Rodrigo's company, Vertex Systems, had grown and expanded over the last 2 years, based on an integration architecture she had designed in the final months of their marriage. It was a robust structure, efficient by the standards of the time, but which depended on a set of technical premises that had become obsolete with the pace of market transformations. Without proper maintenance, without someone who understood the central logic of the system deeply enough to adapt it, the structure would begin to fail at unpredictable points. Failures that would seem random to those who didn't know the origin. Rodrigo didn't know the origin. He had never interested himself in it deeply enough. Daniela had done nothing to accelerate or prevent this process. It wasn't necessary to intervene in something following its natural course. Engineering has its own honesty. It sustains those who understand it and abandons those who use it without understanding. She saved the document on the notebook, closed the file and opened her email. There was a message from the Orbis operations director sent 2 hours earlier, confirming that the team would be at the Lisbon airport to receive her and that the signing meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning the following day. The language was formal and respectful. The tone was of someone who treats the interlocutor as the lead, not as a supporting character. She replied in English with 3 objective lines and closed the email. Rodrigo was telling an anecdote about an American executive who had been impressed by his market vision. Fernanda laughed at the right moment, like someone who rehearsed the reaction. The assistant noted something in a leather notebook that probably would not be read again. The businessman on the cell phone had gone back to talking on the phone. The lawyer in the grey suit had gotten up to get something from the buffet. The room followed its habitual rhythm, that rhythm of waiting that carries tension disguised as elegance. Daniela looked at the clock. 50 minutes until boarding. 50 minutes that would be, depending on what happened, either completely ordinary or absolutely unforgettable. She didn't know for sure. But she had learned to sit comfortably in uncertainty, which was another skill that the post-divorce period had developed in her, with a precision that no course or mentor could teach. The waiter brought the new coffee. She thanked him, wrapped the cup with both hands, and felt the heat rise through her fingers. Outside, the light was changing. The sun was lower, and the runway remained wide and silent, waiting. The episode that changed everything within the marriage was not a single dramatic event. It was a board meeting. A September afternoon, in a glass room on the 10th floor of a commercial building in Itaiim Bibi, with a view of the corridor of skyscrapers on Faria Lima. Daniela was sitting beside Rodrigo before 5 investors who together controlled 40% of the company she had helped build. It was a strategic review meeting, the kind of encounter where the future of the organization was decided based on numbers and narratives. Rodrigo presented the quarter's results with that natural ability of his to transform data into drama and drama into enthusiasm. He knew the rhythm of the room, knew when to pause, knew when to smile. There was a slide showing the new integration platform the company was developing, the one Daniela had architected over the last 9 months in response to an emerging technical demand in the market. It was the centerpiece of the presentation. It was the reason the investors had left their offices and come to that room. When one of the investors asked about the origin of the technical solution, who had conceived the architecture, and what the learning curve was to replicate that knowledge in the team, Rodrigo answered without pausing. He said the company had developed it internally, the result of a structured innovation process he had implemented. He said the engineering team, led by good professionals he had recruited, had arrived at that solution collaboratively. He did not mention Daniela, not once. She was sitting 2 meters from him. She heard everything. She said nothing at that moment. In the car back home later, she brought up the subject carefully. She said she had noticed the omission and would like to understand. Rodrigo did not deny it, did not defend himself with indignation, did not apologize. He said only that that type of technical detail was not relevant for the investors, that what mattered was trust in the leadership, and that the leadership was him. He said this with the naturalness of someone who completely believes what they are saying, and it was that naturalness that broke something in Daniela in a way that no fight could have. Because fights could be resolved. Naturalness was conviction. In the following months, she began to document everything with a discreet meticulousness, not with the intention of using that documentation immediately, but because some part of her already knew, before the conscious part knew, that she would need it one day. She noted dates, archived emails, kept records of which part of the development had been hers and which had come from other sources. She continued working, she continued delivering. And it was in this period of silent delivery that she developed the project that would later become the patent, a method of data reprocessing in distributed environments, more efficient and scalable than any solution available on the market, the result of an insight she had in the early hours of a Sunday morning while trying to solve a specific bottleneck in one of the company's systems. She registered the patent in her own name. Rodrigo signed the document without reading carefully, assuming it was technical bureaucracy without commercial relevance. It was the kind of error that is only possible when one completely underestimates the intelligence of the person by their side. When the separation was formalized, almost 2 years later, the patent had been registered long enough to have legal solidity. Rodrigo's lawyers did not consider it a significant asset. The company stayed with him. The investments, the real estate assets, the contracts. For her, what remained was the compensation and that technical document that no one had thought important enough to dispute. Daniela thought of all this as the sun entered obliquely through the VIP lounge window, and Rodrigo spoke again, this time about an expansion project for the European market. There was a specific irony in that theme she decided not to comment on. The European market. Lisbon. Tomorrow morning. Fernanda had asked for more wine and was talking to the assistant about some travel detail. The room was slightly fuller now. Other passengers had arrived for the same night flight to Lisbon. There was a middle-aged couple with coordinated suitcases, a white-haired executive who seemed to know the environment as well as his own home address, and 2 young men with laptops who had the unmistakable air of those who work in technology and spent the last 6 months building something they believe will change the world. Daniela observed them for a moment with something close to tenderness. She knew that state of mind. She had lived in it for years before understanding that changing the world was a long-term project that did not fit into anyone's expectations besides those who carried it. Rodrigo stood up to get something from the buffet and, passing by her, rested a hand briefly on her shoulder with a familiarity she had not invited. "It's good to see you like this, Danny. Firm, on your feet," he said, with a low voice, his tone almost paternal. There was something there that was almost genuine affection, that distorted version of affection that exists when a person feels they maintain a certain right of emotional ownership over another even after having abandoned them. She did not respond. She only waited for the hand to leave. When he went away toward the buffet, she opened the notebook again. There was a new message in the email, this time from the law firm in Lisbon that would coordinate the signing of the contract. They confirmed the time, the address, and those present. She read it twice, replied in 3 lines, and closed the window. Then she opened the projections document and continued from where she had stopped, like someone who was never interrupted, like someone who carries within themselves a continuity that does not depend on any external environment to exist. The afternoon advanced. The VIP lounge gained more movement as the boarding time approached. A group of businessmen entered, talking loudly about soccer and dollars in a mix that seemed natural to them. A woman with grey hair and elegant posture sat near the window and opened a book without looking at anyone. The waiter circulated with discreet efficiency, collecting glasses, replacing napkins, maintaining the visible order that allows people to concentrate on the disorder they carry inside. Rodrigo returned from the buffet with a plate of cold cuts and sat down again, this time starting a conversation with the white-haired executive who had arrived earlier. Daniela heard them exchanging company names, sectors, mutual acquaintances, that ritual of social mapping that Rodrigo mastered perfectly and that she had never found necessary to learn because there was always him to do it for her, or rather for both, or rather for himself with her, as a background. Fernanda had left to make a call, and the assistant accompanied her. For a few minutes Daniela was indeed alone with her thoughts and with the notebook open, and she took advantage of that interval to do something she hadn't done since they arrived. Relax her shoulders, take a deep breath, let the weight of the casual encounter settle in her body with the clarity that it was just that. A casual encounter, an airport coincidence. It didn't need to mean anything beyond what it was, but she knew it meant something. Not in the way he would think, not as a threat or a wound. It meant that the past and the future had decided to be in the same space for a few hours, and that she was exactly where she needed to be to cross this overlap with integrity. She would not flee, she would not provoke, she would not reveal what was not yet the moment to reveal. She would wait. She was good at that. Then Fernanda returned, and with her returned the tone of the afternoon. Fernanda sat down with a different expression than the one she had left with. Slightly tense, the smile replaced by something more calculated. She looked at Daniela with renewed attention, as if during the call someone had said something that made her recalibrate. Daniela noticed the change and didn't ask anything. She waited. "Someone told me you were working with data," Fernanda said, "that you had developed something, that you had made some noise in the sector." Daniela looked at her with the same calmness. "I work with what I've always worked with," she said. Fernanda nodded slowly, with the expression of someone trying to fit a piece into a puzzle without seeing the full image. Rodrigo arrived back without having heard the beginning and entered the conversation in the middle, as he always did. Daniela closed the notebook. The flight would board in less than 40 minutes, and something in the air of the room had changed in a way she felt like the pressure before a storm, not by the noise, but by the different silence that precedes it. It was Rodrigo who started. It couldn't have been anyone else. He leaned slightly forward, with that gesture of someone about to share something important, and said, "Danny, I have to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. I respect you. I always have. But there are some things you need to understand about how the world works, about the market, about what sustains a real company." Daniela looked at him. She didn't answer. It was the best she could do. He continued, "What you have is technical talent. That is real, it's valuable. But technical talent without structure, without relationships, without the ability to sell a vision, doesn't get anywhere alone. Vertex was what it was because of much more than code. It was because of the network, the credibility, the relationships I spent years building. And you, leaving as you did. Without that, without the support the company gave, well, I'm happy you're on your feet. But be realistic." It was a speech he had rehearsed, not that day, not for that specific occasion, but over years of internal narrative, refining the version of facts that absolved him of any debt to her. Daniela recognized it not by the content, but by the fluidity. It was the type of speech that comes out without stumbling, because it has been traversed many times in the imagination before being said out loud, Fernanda added with a smile. "It's just that sometimes people don't realize that what they did isn't replicable without the right context, without the right people around." Daniela looked at Fernanda for a moment. Then she looked at Rodrigo. And she did something that neither of them expected. She smiled. Not a wide smile, not a smile of confrontation. A small and quiet smile. One of those that contain more information than the entire expression of many people. "You are right about some things," she said to Rodrigo. "Relationships matter, credibility matters, context matters. But there is one thing you never understood, Rodrigo, and I don't say this with anger. I say it as an observation. You confuse the stage with the show." He furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "You were the stage. Beautiful, well-built, visible. And the stage matters. But the show was something else. And when the show went away, the stage was left empty. Silence. A silence different from the previous ones, denser, with more presence. Fernanda found nowhere to fit a comment. The assistant stopped pretending to write. Rodrigo stayed completely still for 2 or 3 seconds, and it was in this interval that Daniela saw him truly, without the armor of performance, like a man who heard something he recognizes as truth, but has no way to admit without collapsing the entire structure he built around it. Then he regained his rhythm. He laughed softly, like someone dismissing a joke they didn't find funny. "Beautiful metaphors," he said. "It was always your way, but metaphors don't pay bills." "No," she said. "Code pays, patents pay, contracts pay." There was something different in the sentence. He noticed but didn't know how to name what it was. Fernanda also noticed. The assistant raised her eyes from the notebook for the first time in many minutes, and it was at that exact moment that the tone of the afternoon changed irreversibly, like a light that changes angle and makes the same scene look completely different. Rodrigo stood up with the pretext of checking the boarding time on the screen at the back of the room. Daniela followed him with her eyes without turning her body. Outside the window, the sun had descended enough for the runway to take on an orange hue that made everything slightly unreal. That kind of light that appears in movies in the moments before something important happens. Fernanda stayed sitting beside Daniela, and for the first time since the trio had installed themselves in that area of the room, there was between the two women something that was neither hostility nor politeness, but a kind of mutual recognition. Two people who had been, each in their own way, instrumentalized by the narrative of the same man, one consciously, the other not. "You really developed something big," Fernanda said, lower, without the performative shine of before. Daniela looked at her with renewed attention. Fernanda wasn't asking. She was confirming something she had discovered during the call outside. "I did," Daniela said, simply. Fernanda nodded slowly and said nothing more. There was in the two words of the answer a completeness that required no elaboration. Developed, simply, without an audience, without recognition, without stopping. Rodrigo returned from the screen with a controlled expression that poorly hid the disturbance beneath. He sat down, crossed his legs, picked up the glass of water, and held it without drinking. He was thinking. Daniela recognized that state in him too. It was the state of someone trying to access information they don't have, and who suddenly realizes that the lack of that information could be a problem. "Who is this company in Lisbon you're meeting with?" he asked, with a casualness that was clearly manufactured. Daniela looked at him. "A European company," she said, with the same economy she had used all afternoon, and nothing more. Rodrigo did not insist, but he kept the question, and she knew he would insist soon in another way, because that was how he functioned when he felt the ground become unstable. He tried to control what he could not see. 35 minutes until boarding. The light outside was increasingly golden, and Daniela felt in the specific weight of that new silence that had installed itself between the three that the moment was approaching in a way that no longer depended on any decision of hers. The two young men with laptops who had arrived earlier were now in an animated conversation about product validation, using technical terms loudly with that mixture of enthusiasm and insecurity that marks those still trying to discover if what they built has real value. Daniela listened to them for a few seconds unintentionally. There was a question one of them asked frequently to the other. "But do you think anyone will pay for this?" It was the hardest and most honest question of technological entrepreneurship. Daniela had the answer, but they weren't asking her. Rodrigo looked at the young men with that air of benevolent condescension of someone who sees himself many years ahead of them. "I was like that once," he said to Fernanda, low, as if it were an intimate observation. "Hungry, trying to prove something." Fernanda smiled. "And now you've proved it." Daniela said nothing, but the small smile returned to the corner of her lips, almost imperceptible, in the same way it appeared in the moments when she knew something others didn't yet know and chose to keep that knowledge to herself for a bit longer, like someone holding a card in their hand and waiting for the exact moment to play it. Rodrigo stood up again, this time with the pretext of going to the bathroom, and when he passed beside her he said almost without stopping, "You were always smart, Danny. You just lacked real ambition." She let the sentence land in the air and did not pick it up. Some statements do not deserve an answer because the answer already exists in the world and is on its way, regardless of anything said at that moment. One just had to wait. And it was shortly after Rodrigo returned that the employee from the VIP lounge reception approached. She was a woman in a dark blazer with a badge on her chest and a tablet in her hand. She walked directly to Daniela with the precise posture of someone who knows exactly whom they are addressing, and said in a clear voice that reached more than the armchair where Daniela was sitting, "Mrs. Marquez, we would like to inform you that your aircraft has just landed. Your team is already on the runway waiting for you. We can accompany you to the private access whenever you wish." The room did not stop. The room never truly stops. But there was something, a collective pause, imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, a fraction of a second where the background noise receded slightly, like the tide before turning. Rodrigo stayed motionless with the glass of water in his hand. Fernanda raised her eyes slowly, like someone who doesn't want to show they heard, but couldn't help it. The two young men with laptops stopped talking. The lawyer in the grey suit raised her face from the computer. The businessman on the cell phone lowered the device for the first time in more than an hour. Daniela thanked the employee with a calm nod and began to put the notebook in her bag with that same composure as always, without haste, without theatricality, without giving the moment more weight than it already had on its own. And when she raised her eyes, she met Rodrigo's. And she saw in them, for the first time in that whole afternoon, not arrogance, not condescension, not manufactured familiarity. She saw shock. The VIP lounge employee waited 2 steps away with the tablet in hand and the trained discretion of someone accustomed to not making judgments about what they witness. Daniela put the notebook in the bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and stood up without rushing any of her gestures. There was in that moment a stillness she had built with much effort over months, and she was not willing to waste it with haste or drama. Rodrigo found his voice before she took a step. "Your aircraft," he said, and the 2 words came from a place different from the usual, without the layer of authority that used to coat everything he said. They were genuinely surprised words, and surprise was, in Rodrigo Cavalcante's language, something very close to a confession. Daniela turned to him calmly. "Yes," she said. Fernanda stood up without realizing she had stood up, as if her body had reacted before the conscious decision arrived. She looked through the window toward the runway with an expression Daniela had never seen in her before, an expression that had no pose. Outside, parked in a privileged position on the private runway of Congonhas Executive Airport, was a mid-sized jet with the Orbis Data Systems identification on the tail, in the deep blue color that was the company's visual identity, with clean lines and the sharpness of an aircraft that traveled more than most people around that window would travel in their entire lives. It was indisputably larger and more recent than the aircraft Rodrigo had rented for the same flight. The entire room, without planning, looked through the window. Rodrigo stood still for a few seconds that seemed much longer. The assistant had stopped existing functionally, reduced to a motionless presence in the background. The 2 young men with laptops exchanged a look. The businessman on the cell phone did not return to the device. Then Rodrigo did what Daniela expected him to do, because she knew him well enough to know he didn't know how to do anything else in that type of situation. He tried to regain control through interrogation. "Who is this company?" "Orbis. Orbis Data Systems. I know that name." "What are you doing with them, Daniela?" The full name. He had used her full name, she noticed. "It's a business meeting," she said, with the same economy as always. "Tomorrow in Lisbon." Rodrigo processed this, then processed the jet, then processed the employee with the tablet. And at some point in this processing, something clicked in a way that left him visibly disturbed, with a disturbance he tried to disguise as indignation. "Business with Orbis," he said, and there was in the phrase a quality of a question he was formulating as a statement, because a question would expose him too much. "Orbis is one of the largest data infrastructure companies in Europe. What would you have to offer them?" Daniela looked at him with a clean attention, without judgment and without affection. It was the look of someone about to say something that doesn't need to be said with cruelty, because the cruelty is already contained in the facts. "The technology they need," she said simply. Fernanda opened her mouth and closed it without any word coming out. It was an image Daniela recorded without effort, because it was the kind of detail that doesn't need formal recording to remain with precision in memory. The employee approached discreetly. "Mrs. Marquez, whenever you are ready." Daniela nodded. She picked up the small suitcase with one hand and turned toward the exit. Rodrigo took a step forward, not to block her, but with that impulse of someone who still believes they can insert themselves into another person's movement just by wanting it very much. "Danny, wait, what technology is this?" She paused, not out of obligation, not for drama, but because there was an answer that was fair to give, not for him, but for the whole story. She turned enough for him to hear her clearly. "The patent you left in the divorce because you thought it was worth nothing," she said. It was exactly that. The phrase landed in the room like a stone lands on a water surface, with a precise impact, and waves that expand in all directions, reaching everything around without the stone needing to do anything more than having fallen. Rodrigo turned pale. Not immediately, but in a process of a few seconds that Daniela observed with the precision of someone reading data in real time. His face went through shock, through calculation, and through something very close to panic, before settling into an expression she had never seen in him. The expression of someone recognizing, for the first time, the dimension of an error they have no way to undo. Fernanda sat down slowly in the armchair, as if her legs had asked for permission before folding. Daniela did not wait any longer. She walked toward the exit beside the employee with the fabric bag on her shoulder and the small suitcase in hand, with the same simple clothes she had entered with the same discreet face and the same contained posture. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, she knew she was leaving that place in a way that she would never again be the person who entered. The VIP lounge door closed behind her, with that soft and definitive sound of a well-built door, the kind of sound that doesn't need to be loud to be final. Outside the VIP lounge, the executive airport corridor had that artificial and controlled luminosity that does not reveal the time of day. It could be morning, or it could be night. There was no way to know by the environment. Daniela knew it was late afternoon because she carried the Congonhas sun in her eyes and because her watch said 5:42 p.m. Less than 2 hours remained until boarding for the regular flight to Lisbon. But she would not take the regular flight. The employee guided her through a side corridor that was not the corridor conventional passengers used. It was narrower, quieter, with a different access that led directly to the private runway area. At some point on this path, Daniela stopped for a second and took a deep breath, not out of hesitation, out of presence. It was important to be present in that moment, to feel the floor under her feet, to notice her own breath, to register that this was happening for real and was not one of the many scenarios she had imagined in the previous 18 months while working alone in the Pinheiros apartment. It was happening, it was real, and she was exactly where she had planned to be. When the door to the outside area opened, the hot and slightly burnt São Paulo afternoon air entered at once, with that specific smell of an airport runway that mixes fuel and heated metal, and which, for Daniela, had always been associated with possibility, with movement, with the idea that the world was larger than any situation she found herself in. She breathed in that smell with gratitude. The Orbis team waited at the foot of the jet stairs. There were 3 people, a man of about 50 in a grey suit and direct expression, whom she identified as Henrik Lund, the European operations director with whom she had exchanged emails for 3 weeks, a younger woman with an iPad in hand who was probably from the legal counsel, and a third element she didn't recognize, but who was clearly there in the capacity of an executive representative by his posture and the quality of his watch. Henrik stepped forward 2 steps when he saw her and extended his hand. "Mrs. Marquez, it is a pleasure finally. We came personally because we understand that what you built deserves this level of care." Daniela shook his hand firmly. "The pleasure is mine," she said in English, with the fluency of someone who used the language for years, not just as a communication tool, but as a technical work language. From the back there was a window to the VIP lounge. She did not turn her head to check. It wasn't necessary, but she knew with the certainty of someone who knows certain people well that Rodrigo Cavalcante was at that window, looking, processing, trying to comprehend the extent of what he had just witnessed. She climbed the jet stairs with the fabric bag on her shoulder and the small suitcase in hand and did not look back. Not because she was fleeing, but because there was no longer anything behind that needed her attention. The present was those stairs, that team, that destination, and the future which she had built with her own hands in silence, waited with the patience of something made to last. Rodrigo was at the window, exactly as she had imagined. He stayed there for longer than anyone around thought reasonable, with the glass of water still in hand and his eyes fixed on the runway where the Orbis jet had landed and from where Daniela had boarded with the composure of someone going to a routine meeting. The assistant tried to say something discreet about their boarding time. He did not answer. Fernanda stayed sitting in the armchair with her eyes on her own lap, with that expression of someone processing information that reorganizes others they thought were already organized. There was something Rodrigo had not yet named for himself, but which began to take shape with that specific slowness of revelations too large to enter all at once. Orbis Data Systems was not a company with whom you closed a contract without having something of very high value to offer. He knew this because he had tried 2 years earlier to open a conversation with the Orbis Partnership Division and had been politely ignored. The company had an extremely rigorous partner selection process. They didn't receive startups. They didn't receive proposals without a proven track record of scale. And they certainly didn't send a private jet to pick someone up unless that someone had something they needed urgently. The patent. Daniela's words returned with a clarity he hadn't been able to fully process at the moment. The patent you left in the divorce because you thought it was worth nothing. Rodrigo closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the runway was empty where the jet had been. It had taken off while he stood still watching. He went back to the armchair with steps that didn't have the rhythm from before. The assistant asked him something he didn't hear. Fernanda said his name in a low voice. He raised a hand, the gesture of, "Give me a minute," and stayed in silence. He was trying to remember. He vaguely remembered signing something during the divorce process, a technical document the lawyer had described as commercially irrelevant. A data compression solution, the lawyer had said. Very niche, very specific, no immediate market application. Rodrigo had signed without reading because there were other much more important documents to guarantee: the company's assets, the current contracts, the servers, the client portfolio. The patent was a technical crumb, a footnote. Orbis Data Systems had sent a private jet to Lisbon for a footnote. Then the disturbance became something sharper, because Rodrigo was, amidst all his limitations, a functional businessman. And a functional businessman, when he starts to calculate, doesn't stop at the point that comforts him. He goes to the point that exposes him. If Daniela's technology was what the Orbis presence suggested, what did that mean for Vertex Systems? He remembered a meeting 3 weeks earlier with the CTO he had hired to replace the technical layer after the original team gradually dissolved. The CTO had presented warnings about increasing instabilities in the platform's central architecture, problems described with the careful language of someone who doesn't want to alarm but needs to record it. Rodrigo had listened, asked for a formal report, and postponed the conversation to the following month. The following month was now. He took his cell phone and opened his email. There were 3 messages from the CTO sent over the last week, each with a tone slightly more urgent than the previous one. He had read the first lines of each and archived them with the intention of answering later. He opened the last one now and read to the end for the first time. The CTO described with technical precision a set of interdependent failures in the data processing layer that were affecting 3 large corporate contracts. He described correction attempts that had worked partially, but without solving the root of the problem. And he described in an almost apologetic footnote sentence that the origin of the failures seemed to be in an architectural premise that the current team could not fully trace because the original documentation was incomplete. Rodrigo read that sentence twice. The documentation was incomplete because the person who had made the documentation had left 2 years earlier and taken with them all the deep knowledge of the system's logic, not on paper, in their head. Fernanda said his name again, this time with more urgency. He raised his eyes from the cell phone and found her with an expression he recognized as the expression people have when they realize something guaranteed is no longer guaranteed. "We need to talk," she said. He knew. But before that, he needed to talk to someone. He went out to the corridor with the cell phone at his ear, dialing the lawyer who had coordinated the divorce. It was late. The lawyer did not answer. Rodrigo stayed in the cold corridor of the executive airport, with the phone in hand and the growing awareness that he had handed over something of immeasurable value because he had never been attentive enough to recognize value in what he didn't know how to do. On the runway outside, where minutes before there had been a blue jet with the Orbis identification, there was now only the orange reflection of the March sun on the asphalt. Daniela had gone, and taken with her, with all the calm in the world, that which had one day been discarded as irrelevant. The airport internal screen signaled the start of boarding for the night flight to Lisbon. Rodrigo looked at the notice for a long moment before returning to the room, where Fernanda waited with the same closed expression and the silence of someone re-evaluating much more than that night's destination. "What exactly did she develop?" Fernanda asked when he returned, not with hostility but with the precision of someone who wants to understand the size of what is before her before deciding how to react. Rodrigo looked at his wife. During the time in the corridor, He had done a quick search on his phone for the name of the patent that had left his memory when Daniela mentioned it. He found results he didn't expect with that density. Technical articles citing the method. A market analysis from a European consultancy describing the technology as potentially disruptive in distributed data operations. A note on a specialized site mentioning that Orbis had demonstrated interest in acquiring or licensing solutions of this nature. "Something I discarded," he said to Fernanda, with an honesty that was not natural to him and which therefore sounded strange even to his own ears. Fernanda nodded slowly. Then she turned her gaze to the window. The sun was practically on the horizon, and the Congonhas runway had acquired that cold metal color that comes when the daylight prepares to leave. A commercial plane taxied slowly toward takeoff, with that slow majesty that large planes have when they are still on the ground. They stayed in silence. The assistant realized there was nothing to note and stayed with the leather folder closed on her lap. The only sound was the murmur of the room and the air conditioning system, maintaining everything at the exact temperature of those who don't need to feel the heat outside. Rodrigo thought of Daniela climbing the jet stairs with the fabric bag on her shoulder. He thought of that small and quiet smile she had given in the middle of the conversation, when he spoke about technical talent without vision, about stage and show, about real ambition. Every phrase uttered with the certainty of a winner now had a different weight, like clothes that fit the wrong size and reveal exactly what they try to hide. There was a question he didn't want to formulate, but which was already formulated within him without permission. While he had spent the last 2 years displaying what he had, what exactly had Daniela been building alone, in silence, in the Pinheiros apartment he had never visited? The boarding screen flashed again. The flight was waiting. Rodrigo stood up, adjusted his navy blue suit and looked one last time through the window with a view of the runway. Nothing more was there besides the asphalt and the light that was leaving. But the absence of the blue jet was a presence in itself, dense and impossible to ignore, like the space an object leaves when it is removed from a place where it stayed long enough to be part of the landscape. He walked toward the gate. Fernanda followed him. The assistant followed 2 meters behind, and the VIP lounge resumed its habitual rhythm, indifferent, as it always is when the stories that pass through it end and others begin, without pausing, without judging, without keeping anything besides the smell of expensive air conditioning and the cold light that treats everyone with the same elegant distance. The Orbis jet flew at 30,000 feet altitude, with that smoothness that mid-sized planes have when the weather cooperates and the route is clear. Daniela was reclined in a cream leather armchair with the notebook open, but she wasn't working. She was looking through the oval window at the dark expanse of the Atlantic, forming below as the night arrived before them on the Portugal side. Henrik Lund was sitting in the row ahead, reviewing documents with the quiet seriousness of an executive who solves problems at cruise speed. The legal counsel was sleeping 2 seats ahead with headphones on. The third Orbis representative, who had introduced himself as Matthias, strategy director, worked in silence with his laptop and a glass of mineral water. There was champagne in a bottle on ice near the cabin entrance, placed there by the crew with that discreet hospitality of private aircraft. Daniela had not touched it. Not out of refusal of the gesture, but because it wasn't time for champagne yet. It would be time tomorrow after the signing, when the contract with all its numbers and all its clauses became real paper with real names and real responsibilities she had built over 18 months of invisible work. She thought of the airport. She thought of the VIP lounge and the oblique afternoon light. She thought of Rodrigo's face at the moment the employee had approached with the tablet. There was a specific type of satisfaction in that moment she wouldn't name as revenge, because revenge presupposes that the other's pain was the goal, and it wasn't. The goal had always been the work, the construction, the recovery of the authorship of her own story. What had happened in the VIP lounge was just the natural consequence of someone who chose to work, while the other chose only to perform. But it would be dishonest to say she had felt nothing when his face lost its color. She had felt it. She had felt the specific liberation of someone who saw with their own eyes that the narrative the other built about you was not real, had never been real, and that the reality was this: the jet, the team, the contract, the European company that sent for what the other had discarded. Henrik turned in his armchair. "Are you comfortable?" he asked in English, with the Scandinavianly precise accent she had learned to identify in their email exchanges. "Very," she said. "Thank you." "Tomorrow will be an important day," he said. "But I want you to know that on our side the decision was made weeks ago. This meeting is more of a formality than a negotiation. When we saw what you built, there was no doubt." Daniela nodded. "How long has Orbis been following the work?" Henrik paused as if weighing how much to reveal. "Since the technical article you published a year ago in a data engineering magazine. Our market intelligence team identified the publication as relevant. It took some months to confirm that the method described in the article was derived from the patent and that you were the exclusive holder. From there, it was a matter of making contact through the right channel." Daniela processed this. The article had been published without expectation of a corporate audience. It was a technical text for a specialized magazine with modest circulation, the kind of publication someone outside the sector would never read. But Orbis had a market intelligence team that read exactly those publications, because that was where real innovations appeared before appearing anywhere else. "There is one thing I need to ask," she said. "The agreement. The structure we discussed by email provided for exclusive licensing for 5 years. Is that still on the table?" Henrik smiled with the composure of someone about to improve an offer. "The board reviewed the proposal last week. What we will put on the table tomorrow goes beyond licensing. We want a development partnership with an equity stake in your company and an executive role for you in the Orbis Innovation Division for Latin America. Structure to be defined according to your preference in terms of autonomy and governance." Daniela stayed in silence for a moment, not out of total surprise because something in her had already intuited the proposal would grow, but out of respect for the weight of what was being said. Equity stake, executive role, autonomy. They were words she had stopped associating with her own life when the divorce swept away what she had built together with Rodrigo. And now they returned, not as a concession from someone who wanted something in return, but as recognition of value she had generated alone, with her own intelligence and her own work. "I understand," she said. "We need to see the details." "Of course," Henrik said. "That's what contracts are for." He went back to the documents. Daniela went back to the window. The Atlantic was now a completely black surface with the weak reflection of the stars and, occasionally, the lights of a ship below, a tiny luminous dot crossing the dark with the patience of long routes. She thought of her mother, who had worked her whole life as a math teacher in a public school in Santo André, and who had said to her when she was 15 and started to show talent for programming, "The knowledge that enters through the forehead doesn't leave through the door." They were simple words with the direct wisdom of someone who didn't have time for elaborate philosophy, but had distilled something true about the world into a single aphorism. Knowledge doesn't leave through the door. Rodrigo had taken the company, the contracts, the public reputation, but he hadn't managed to take what was in Daniela's head, and he never would. The plane crossed a light turbulence and returned to stability. Daniela closed the notebook, leaned her head back, and let her eyes grow heavy. She had slept poorly in the last 2 weeks with the adrenaline of preparing for that trip mixed with the awareness that what was on the way was real and irreversible. Now at 35,000 feet altitude, with the contract a few hours from becoming reality, exhaustion finally had permission to land. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without weight. That same night, in a Lisbon hotel where Rodrigo had booked a suite with a view of the Tagus, the situation was very different. He stayed awake with his cell phone in hand and his laptop open, reading and rereading the CTO's emails, searching the company history for the technical documents from the first years, trying to find some line of code, some configuration file, some clue of the original architecture that was now missing, as a foundation would be missing to a building. He found fragments, comments in code, signed with the initials DM. Technical design files with dates of 2015, 2016, 2017, all produced by someone who had thought out the system with a depth that the subsequent files did not reach. DM. Daniela Marquez. Fernanda had gone to sleep without saying much. Before leaving the suite's lounge, she rested her hand on his shoulder for a second, without saying anything. It was a gesture of presence, but also of warning. "I am here, but I don't know for how long, if the ground continues moving like this." Rodrigo dialed the lawyer late at night. He explained what had happened in concise terms. There was a long pause on the other side. "The patent was legally ceded in the divorce. There is nothing to contest," the lawyer said. "If she developed derivations and improvements later, they are 100% hers. You have no right over what she built after the separation." Rodrigo stayed in silence. He knew that was the answer. He needed to hear it out loud for it to become completely real. He hung up. He stayed another hour before the laptop with the DM files on the screen and the imagined sound of the Tagus outside that he couldn't see but knew was there, wide and indifferent, like all rivers at night when the city finally goes quiet. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He opened Daniela's contact on his cell phone. He stayed looking at the number for a long time. He typed a message. He deleted it. He typed again. He deleted it again. The third version was shorter than all the others. "We need to talk, not about the past, about the future of Vertex. Call me when you can." He sent it before he could delete it again. The 2 blue ticks that would indicate reading did not come that night. Daniela was sleeping in a jet at 35,000 feet altitude, with a rested face and the notebook closed, crossing the Atlantic toward the contract that would change everything, without her cell phone on, without any pending matter that needed attention before Lisbon. The message would wait. Some things can wait, especially when the one waiting is the one who arrived too late. Lisbon woke up with a copper-colored sky and the light hitting obliquely over the Tagus at an angle that made the river look made of another material than water. Daniela was on her feet at 7 in the morning in a hotel room with a view of the castle, with a cup of coffee in hand, her hair tied back and the same face as always. That face that didn't ask for attention, but received it anyway, when there was something in the eyes that betrayed depth. At 10 o'clock, sharp, she was sitting at a long, dark wood table in the Orbis office in Chiado, with Henrik Lund to her right, the legal counsel in front, and Matthias at the back with the expression of someone waiting for the outcome of something he himself helped build. The Portuguese lawyer who had coordinated the legal details on the Lisbon side was positioned in the corner with the serenity of someone who had already read that document dozens of times and knew every comma. Daniela read the complete contract, every paragraph, every subclause, not out of distrust but because that was how she had always worked, with total attention to what was before her, without delegating the understanding to anyone. It was a posture that had irritated Rodrigo in the years of marriage, that insistence on understanding before signing, that habit of pausing where others advanced through trust. Today that posture was there at that table as one of the reasons why the agreement she was about to sign was completely, undeniably, irrevocably hers. In the contract was exactly what Henrik had mentioned in the jet, an equity stake in DM Tecnologia Aplicada with a capital injection sufficient to triple the development capacity, an executive role as innovation director of the Orbis data division for Latin America, based in São Paulo and with autonomy to build a team, progressive royalties on the licensing of technology derived from the patent, and a clause she had expressly requested in the email negotiations, and which was there on paper, with the exact language she had proposed. All future developments derived from the original technology would remain under the documented authorship of Daniela Marques. She signed on every marked page, with a firm hand, without hesitating. Henrik extended his hand when she finished. "Welcome," he said in English. "Thank you," she said, in Portuguese. And it was the first time in that room she had spoken in Portuguese, and the word sounded different because of it, heavier and more her own, like a declaration of origin that didn't need translation. There was a round of greetings. The champagne that had stayed in the bottle in the jet appeared there too, in a table version, in crystal glasses, and this time she accepted it. She drank a sip. She put the glass on the table and looked through the window at the roofs of Chiado with that Lisbon light that is completely different from the São Paulo light, less urgent, more horizontal, older. 3 hours later, back in the hotel room before resting for the return flight the next day, she turned on her cell phone. There were 23 messages. Most were professional, confirmations, congratulations from industry contacts who had already heard of the movement. One was from her mother saying only that she was thinking of her. One was from a college friend who had seen some comment circulating on LinkedIn. And there was one from Rodrigo, sent at 2 in the morning. We need to talk, not about the past, about the future of Vertex. Call me when you can. Daniela read the message once, then she read it again, not because she needed more attention to understand the content, but because there was something in those words that needed to settle before she decided what to do with them. There was, in Rodrigo's request, an honesty she had never heard coming from him in any of the many conversations they had had over 11 years. Not about the past. It was a small sentence with a specific weight. He had recognized, even without saying it explicitly, that the past was a territory where he was wrong, and that there was no way to navigate there without that condition. She typed a reply. Not long, just, "When I return to São Paulo, we can schedule a talk." No promise of a result, just an openness to dialogue, which was the minimum the situation deserved and the maximum she was willing to offer at that moment. She sent it. She rested the cell phone on the bedside table, and she stayed there for a moment sitting on the edge of the bed in the Lisbon hotel, with the folded contract in her bag, the cup of coffee cooling on the table, and the late afternoon light of Portugal coming through the blinds with that soft and inclined quality that seems to ask permission before entering. She thought of everything. The Pinheiro's apartment, the notebook, the late nights, the patent, the jet, the table in Chiado. Rodrigo's face at the VIP lounge window in Congonhas when he realized what he had let go, and then she stopped thinking about all that, because there was something more urgent and more beautiful to think about, what she would build now, with a team, with a budget, with autonomy, with her name on the contract and no shadow longer than her own. The answer was everything she wanted, and wanting she always knew how to do very well. If you've made it this far, it's because you recognize that some stories need to be heard to the end to make complete sense. Daniela's story is one of someone who worked in silence when no one was looking and flourished when the moment arrived. Here on the channel, we bring stories like this every week. Stories of new beginnings, of intelligence that doesn't fade, of people who chose to move forward when it would have been easier to give up. If this story touched you, leave your like, because it tells the channel it's worth continuing. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever gone through a moment where you were underestimated and found strength where no one expected? We want to hear. Until the next story. End of story.